Everyone is sleeping on gun nights, and I simply shan't stand for it. These are what are called Cuirassiers, maybe Cuirassiers, and they were a cavalry unit that first appeared in the mid to late 16th century in Europe, and persisted in use basically up until World War I. Note that they're not actually knights, I'm just being silly. Given that they were not necessarily landed nobility and came into prominence far after the vassalage system had kind of gone out of fashion, to understand why it made sense to put a guy in armor on a horse with a pistol, we're gonna have to backtrack a little bit to discuss firearms in Europe and how that changed military technology and military tactics. Contrary to popular belief, guns did not put armor immediately out of business. We see the first personal firearms start to develop in late 14th century Italy, but armor hasn't gone away. In fact, many breastplates of this time were proofed, where a shot was fired directly into the metal to show that it was up to snuff. But warfare is now in a little bit of a pickle, because it turns out guns are relatively cheap to produce versus the armor you would need to protect against them. It becomes really efficient to furnish like 50 guys with muskets when you have like one guy in armor for the same price. Also, with the rise of pikemen, cavalry aren't as useful as they used to be. The armored cavalry charge was a really preeminent tactic in early modern Europe, but as you start to get these lines of dudes bristling with pikes, that becomes less of a good idea. Which brings us back to our pew-pew horse friend! Cuirassiers often use something called the caracole tactic, where they would basically ride up to the enemy line of pikemen, go pew-pew-pew-pew with their pistols till they'd run out of bullets, run to the back to reload, while their infantry units move up to support. This worked pretty well at first until the pikemen started being supported by tons of riflemen, so a couple of pistols aren't really going to match that firepower. But it's this really interesting push and pull, where when the enemy line switches out their pikemen for riflemen, it makes more sense to go back to a melee weapon like a sword or a saber, where you can use more of a shock tactic where you just bust right up into them, similar to the old cavalry charges of old. Anyways, I think Cuirassier armor is really beautiful as well as really interesting. In order to be shot-proof, it was much heavier than previous forms of armor. This guy at the Met weighs about like 80 pounds, whereas German Gothic armors were typically about 50 to 60. You'll note that he's got his cute little proofing mark in his breastplate. Most Cuirassier armors lack the greaves, they were just swapped out for riding boots. In later periods, you'll also see them start to lose the limb protection as well. They'll basically just keep the breastplate, the long tassets up to the knee, and in later periods like the 17th and 18th century, they basically lose everything but the breastplate. Again, it all comes down to a matter of efficiency and cost when you're arming larger and larger armies. Priority is keeping the most "uh-oh, don't hit me" parts of the bodies safe.